I'm very happy to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon, where we have some exciting guests on in the panel to discuss the future of offshore wind development in the UK, and particularly discussing the topics around the planning process and looking at successfully planning for offshore wind as the UK transitions to net zero, and looking at future energy security. Just a couple of points of order. So this will be running from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. The panelists will be giving a quick introduction and their views on the topic. As we're going through, we're going to be using the Q&A box. So feel free at any time just to drop some questions in there, and then we'll pick them up at the second half of the session. So yeah, great to hear the questions you have on this interesting topic. As an introduction to myself, before I pass around to the panelists, I'm Dan Kyle Spearman. I'm director at Magenta Renewables Consultancy. We are a consultancy with experience across the environmental, technical, commercial, and really having the hands-on development experience across the life cycle of a project. So I'm very pleased to be chairing this session, and I think it's a really important topic. There's where we are in the UK, we have nearly 15 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity already installed, but we have also a significant pipeline of about 100 gigawatts. And excitingly, there's some big ambitions for offshore wind up to 2030. The government target is to quadruple this, coming to about 50 gigawatts by 2030. I think for the discussion here, of course, what is of critical importance is the planning process to take this number of projects through across the different jurisdictions. Offshore wind, fixed bottom is a relatively mature technology, and there's a lot of knowns around the environmental and technical impacts. But what's at an earlier stage is floating offshore wind. But this is a key part of the government's plan for offshore wind in the UK. So we'll touch on some of the impacts of and considerations for floating wind in the planning process. I'll pass now around to the panelists to give their introductions. I'd first like to open the floor to Andrew Fraser Urquhart, KC, from Francis Taylor Building. If you'd like to give an introduction.
Thanks, Dan. I wonder whether just to give the audience a flavour of who we all are first, we might just introduce ourselves individually and then come back to me for my introductory remarks. I'm Andrew Fraser Urquhart at King's Council. As Dan says, I practice from Francis Taylor Building, which is the leading really infrastructure planning set. FTB itself engaged in all sorts of different infrastructure projects. There isn't really a major infrastructure project that you'll hear of with which FTB's not had a major involvement. Personally, I've been involved in a number of DCOs promoting offshore wind. I worked in particular for the promoters on the environmental aspects of the East Anglia 2 scheme. Also in the halcyon days, and I hope days which I'll have to come back again soon, I did a lot of work on onshore wind as well. It was actually one of my favourite areas of practice, doing onshore wind. And just as by way of a humble brag, I suppose, as we call it in the trade, I'm identified as a leading planning silk in the Chambers and Partners Guide, the Legal 500, and in the Planning Magazine listings for my sins. So that's me. I'll be taking you briefly through the some of the nuts and bolts of the planning policy regime and where we're up to with various aspects of that before passing over to others. But just by way of introduction, perhaps I can bring Julie in just to introduce herself, and then we'll rotate back to do the presentations.
Of course. Thank you, Andrew. So welcome everybody, good afternoon. My name's Julie Drew-Murphy. I'm a technical director within CEA, Collaborative Environmental Advisors. We are a specialist company who support offshore wind, nuclear and interconnector development. We provide strategic, environmental and consents advice through the full life cycle of projects. So from early feasibility all the way through development, taking them through marine license, DCO, consent applications, all the way through, and we're now seeing sort of decommissioning type work coming through as well. I've worked in renewables for the past 20 years, again, supporting sort of full life cycle development from early round one developments in offshore wind to current day round five and beyond. So that's a bit of my background. If I pass over to Nikki to give an update.
Thanks, Julie. Welcome everyone to the webinar. My name is Nikki Young. I'm Associate Director at Gobi Consultants, which is now part of the APEM group. So Gobi, for those who don't know us, is leading provider of consents and permitting services to the offshore wind farm industry. And to date, we've supported, I believe, over 55 offshore wind farm projects, which is now upwards of 40 gigawatts of generation capacity. So we've got our fingers in quite a lot of the developments in the UK. As part of the APEM group, we've got over 200 people who are dedicated to the offshore wind sector, and that includes experienced DIA project managers, as well as one of the largest ornithology teams in the industry, HRA expertise, a growing marine mammals team, physical processes, benthic, and we can now offer onshore EIA capability as well. So we can offer the full package for the full development life cycle of an offshore wind farm project. I've worked for Gobi for a couple of years, and previous to that, I worked for developers both in onshore wind development and offshore wind development. And I'm currently working across the development lifecycle on projects at the kind of pre-bid stage all the way through to post-consent. Okay, that's me. Thank you. Back to Dan.
Great, thank you. Well, Andrew, I'll let you kick off.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Now, don't hold me to this, but this might be one of the sessions where the lawyer has the least to say of all of the contributors. I hope that's going to be the case. But I will just give you a bit of a bare bones introduction as to where policy stands and where it might be going with the main indicators of Labour government policy beginning to become at least reasonably clear. Now, it remains the case that the big beasts for the consenting process are the national policy statements EN1 and EN3, and they have been relatively recently revised. Consultation during the course of 2023, promulgation late 23 of the new EN1s, and actually coming into force in their current versions in January of 2024. EN1 being the overall energy generation NPS, EN3 talking about renewables. The really important, I suppose, factors of EN1 are the entirely explicit indications that come from para 3 to 6 and following, that first of all, the need for new energy generation schemes of all sorts within the NSIP regime is deemed to be urgent, and that substantial weight is to be afforded to the benefits of the bringing forward of new electrical generation schemes. And then finally, 328, that the decision makers are not required to consider or assess the individual contribution that a scheme may make to meeting the urgent need, and in the case of offshore wind, where there is a set objective, to contributing towards that set objective. Now, that has the important consequence that the arguments which objectors would sometimes bring about the potential relative inefficiency of a scheme, or the fact that there may be better alternatives, or anything of that nature. That all is now dealt with by the national policy statement, and those two substantially important factors for any decision maker, that the need is urgent and substantial weight should be given to the benefits of the scheme. EN1 also explicitly referred, as Dan mentioned, to the objective, and this was even under the old Conservative government, of securing 50 gigawatts of installed offshore wind capacity by 2030, of which it was suggested that up to 5 gigawatts could be floating offshore wind, which, given Dan, I know, is going to speak about the interest and importance of what is described as the emerging technology of floating, is an important endorsement within government policy. EN3, also again the new version in force January 2024, sets out a range of important factors which need to be considered when promoting offshore wind scheme. It's too detailed to go into any sort of detail on, but just to note that it places considerable importance, obviously rightly, first of all, on network connection issues, and secondly, the need for coordination of schemes wherever possible to bring about the maximum benefits in terms of coordination of network links, assessment of environmental effects, and compensatory measures. It also makes explicit reference to the ongoing work to develop offshore wind environmental standards, the Offshore Winds Environmental Improvement Package, which has had a somewhat checkered legislative history, and it's worth just considering briefly at the moment. The idea of streamlining and speeding up and customizing environmental assessment for the purposes of offshore wind was touted by the last Conservative government, and where we have reached to is that the Energy Act of 2023 put in place a number of measures, the Marine Recovery Fund, the ability to treat as strategic and to coordinate compensatory measures, but also in section 293, the empowerment of the Secretary of State to bring forward regulations to set out bespoke types of regime for the assessment of offshore wind throughout the entire life cycle of the offshore wind development package, so right from commencement to decommissioning. Changes to the environmental assessment regime there in a bespoke way, changes to the habitat regs assessments as well. Obviously, this is the kind of thing, actually, I suspect, which is an ability that we now have as part of the changes into our legal framework and constitutional framework brought about by Brexit. Now, we were promised by the old Conservative government in the autumn of 2023 that there would be consultation on these measures. As yet, nothing, I think, has come forward, certainly not that I've been aware of, and this is still a live issue. Now, this act obviously remains on the statute book. It's intended to be brought into force in due course, but we will have to see what, if anything, emerges from the change of government, and indeed more broadly what the government's intentions are with respect to this regime of customised and bespoke assessment for offshore wind. Then the incoming Labour government adds yet another layer of uncertainty as to what changes might be coming forward. In terms of the King's Speech, the only thing which touches directly upon offshore wind, obviously onshore wind, major policy changes already, but we'll talk about that on another day. But with respect to offshore wind, the bringing forward of the enabling bill for the Great British Energy Company and the suggestion of coordination, particularly with the Crown Estates, with a view to releasing seabed land for offshore wind development. Now, the bill as it's published is very much an enabling bill, it won't do much more than empower the government to bring the company about and set out some of its objectives, and we will have to see what significant role it will play, if any, in bringing about coordination of the approaches to development. Obviously not specifically a planning matter, but something which will no doubt have effects on the process. Also from the Labour government, we have seen published just a couple of days ago the intention to bring about a strategic plan for long-term infrastructure involving the four governments in the United Kingdom. The indication that such a plan will be published in 2026, and it may be something we can talk about in due course as to what role this strategic plan will have, but no doubt it will feature strongly the government's intention to bring forward at pace the increased achievement of offshore wind. So that's the thus far, beyond general statements of support for all renewables, but obviously including offshore wind. That's thus far the main statements from the new government. And then finally, just the last part of this process to consider is the amendments to the DCO regime, which were brought forward last year and earlier this year, culminating with new advice notes in April 2024. Again, one would have to say probably a little bit of tinkering around the edges of the DCO process, seeking to streamline the process a little, adding greater flexibility in the giving of advice from central government before and during the process. And one would hope that they will have some ability to improve the process, which has increasingly, I think, become a little bit bogged down. It's moved away a little from the clean achievement of pre-application consultation and so forth applications, and then a swift 6-month limited examination period, and then swift decision making thereafter. A number of examinations obviously going over their 6 months, although it's still relatively rare, but unfortunately much less rare now is delay in ministerial decisions. And although there was a flurry of granting of consents, particularly for onshore solar facilities at the beginning of the new administration, in fact there have been a number also of postponements of DCO decisions, and that's been an increasing feature. One would hope that these reforms can do something about that, although much of the responsibility obviously for that lays at central government's door. And therefore that's a new package of measures brought forward. What will be interesting to see is whether or not, with this desire for much greater deployment of offshore wind, the physical mechanics and the human element of the planning process and the human resources devoted to the planning process by the public sector side of the equation, the consultees and the decision makers, is going to be up to the task of processing a much greater volume of applications. Although it's, as Dan has said now, at least with the case of fixed offshore wind, it's a relatively mature technology with effects and processes of assessment reasonably well understood. One will have to wait and see just whether the human capital is there to enable the kind of progress that the government is looking for. We shall see. That's perhaps my biggest concern about the process, and we'll see what points discussion brings up about the legalities within the system. But with that general introduction, I'll turn the floor over to Julie.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'd just like to introduce, so I will be picking up on some of the environmental challenges that the industry is facing, and building on some of what Andrew has just talked about in terms of the legal side of things. I think one of the greatest challenges that we're facing at the moment with the expansion of offshore wind is around HRA derogation, compensation requirements, impacts to MCZs, and the requirements for measures of equivalent environmental benefit. I'm sure we could spend an entire hour talking just about that topic. So I'm naturally going to keep this relatively high level, but certainly would welcome some questions as we get into things. So just to introduce the topic, for those that aren't necessarily familiar with HRA and derogation, this is generally, it's required that if through the HRA process as a project is being developed, if it is deemed that that project is likely to have or could have a potential impact on the integrity of a European designated site, that being a special protection area or an SAC, then developers have a way of seeking derogation to the habitats regulations, whereby the project would be allowed to proceed with those adverse effects on integrity, but they would be required to compensate for the impacts that they were having. There's a number of tests that the developer would have to pass. So this includes proving that you've looked at all of the potential alternatives, that the project itself is in the interests of the public, that it proceeds. And if everything is concluded that that is positive, that is the way, then that project can proceed with developing compensation measures and potential MEEB, where we're talking about marine conservation zones. So we're already seeing that the thresholds for requiring compensation have already been met in certain areas of the UK, so particularly the east coast of England. And as more developments come online, the requirement for compensation is only likely to increase. The round 5, so Celtic Sea area, the plan level HRA that was conducted by the Crown Estates concluded that currently that region of the UK that necessarily doesn't sort of breach those so-called thresholds, that potentially that compensation wouldn't be required. But obviously project level HRAs are going to be required, and obviously with further development that may happen in that area, we don't know, compensation may be required further down the line. So the real issue here around the compensation is sort of the complexity of the requirements, what that compensation looks like, and the time that it takes to develop those compensation packages. So it's not necessarily, it's one project that you could develop that will compensate for the impacts. It may be a suite of measures that you have to develop. So for kittiwakes, it's potentially offshore nesting structures, predator eradication for auks, but we could also be looking at secondary measures such as seagrass restoration or oyster bed restoration. All of this requires a high level of stakeholder engagement to ensure that the stakeholders are comfortable with the compensation measures and that they are appropriate for the impacts and the location that the impacts are taking place. So the mechanism for agreeing this compensation is also in this sort of state of flux. I think Andrew alluded to it, that currently we have a thing called the Offshore Wind Environmental Improvement Package, which is being led by DEFRA. They are looking at strategic-led compensation, and there's the Marine Recovery Fund, whereby developers provide funding for a package of measures that could be deployed to compensate for their impacts. But we're also seeing, because those measures aren't quite there yet, they haven't necessarily been developed to a level that would be suitable. We're also seeing project-led measures, so individual projects taking forward their own potential measures that could compensate for those potential impacts. And the pace at which things is changing, as you can imagine, with all of these projects coming forward, reliant on different measures, the pace of change is also quite fast. We're already seeing projects like Hornsey 4 who have gone through the DCO process. They've secured their package of compensation, but because of new things that are coming forward, they're also now seeking changes to what they previously agreed because things have moved on. It's worth noting as well that this process doesn't stop at the point at which you reach your consent and you've agreed your measures. You then have to implement those measures, and these have to be implemented before construction commences. This obviously may require substantial spend before a project has reached FID, which we know in this sort of climate that is a challenging position to be in for many developers. And there are ongoing obligations as well, so that you would be required to manage and monitor these measures through the life of the project to ensure that they're still delivering on the compensation that is required. So I guess just to wrap up on this sort of topic, it is becoming more commonplace that compensatory measures are required for offshore wind. So I think developers should be planning for this early in their development. So as soon as sites are awarded, or you should be looking at whether compensation measures are likely to be required. And I'm talking sort of across the board of HRA, but also MCZ as well, and MEEB. Engaging with stakeholders early is crucial, and actively listening to your stakeholders as well to involve them in the development of plans. And I think one important point to note as well here is that the maturity of your compensation plans, be it at the strategic level or project-led, need to be at a really mature level at the point at which you're submitting your application. We're seeing the examining authorities having a lot of scrutiny on compensation measures. Naturally, it is the right thing to do. So it's just making sure that when you're going into that process, that those plans and projects have reached a certain maturity that the DCO process, the examination process, can then examine and make sure that they are suitable for the impacts that you're taking forward. And on a company level is making sure that you have allowed the time and investment to develop those compensatory measures from the outset. So I think that was a whistle-stop tour of HRA and derogation measures. But if I may, I will pass over now to Nikki to provide some further insights.
Thanks, Julie. So I'm going to sort of take that on a little bit from what Julie was talking about in terms of HRA compensation. Something that we're seeing crop up more and more in development of offshore wind farms is the requirement to offer net gain. So I think it's generally accepted that preserving what we have in terms of biodiversity at the moment is not really enough, that we need to be aiming for better for providing a form of net gain. Onshore, obviously, this is fairly mature now. We have biodiversity net gain and specific quantitative targets and ways of measuring biodiversity net gain. But it's not that mature in the offshore environment. It's much more complex to try and work out how that can be assessed and calculated and brought forward. But in the meantime, for offshore wind, we're seeing a move towards including non-price objectives and targets within leasing rounds. So the latest Crown Estate leasing round, round 5, includes a specific requirement to include a level of positive environmental and social outcome within the agreements for lease for those projects. And as the offshore wind farm auctions in the Netherlands have shown, that including quality criteria in those leasing rounds does drive innovation in nature positive design and environmental net gain deliverables. So although that wasn't part of the ScotWind auction, we are seeing that in the clients that we're supporting on our flow projects in Scotland, there is a general appetite to build in some nature and nature positive design into those projects. But in the early stages of designing those projects, it's obviously very clear that they are complicated. It's a nascent technology. There's a lot of uncertainty, both in terms of the technology and developing in deeper waters. And so because there isn't that policy drive there at the moment, the nature positive design seems to be taking a bit of a back seat. So round 5 could potentially be the first leasing round where this positive environmental outcome and net gain is a significant part of development. And as Julie was touching on in terms of HRA compensation, this inclusion of additional positive environmental outcome and net gain will be additional to any mitigation or compensation that will be required as part of your or as a result of your environmental impact assessment and habitats regulations assessment. So again, it's essential, as with compensation, to think about that right at the beginning of your project. You need to consider which stakeholders can be engaged in conversations about how those sorts of projects could be delivered. There will be cost implications and risks, and also potentially amendments required to the design, all of which are things that are much easier to do at the beginning of your development process than they are to fit in partway through. So with ScotWind floating projects, we are starting to see some additional environmental impacts and slightly different risks that you might experience with a more traditional fixed bottom project. So I'm just going to give a fairly high level overview of some of those things that we've experienced at the moment, and challenges that we need to tackle if we're going to hit those targets for delivering offshore wind towards net zero. So the elephant in the room is wet storage. Wet storage is a fundamental part of delivering floating offshore wind, because in order to construct the wind farms, the turbines need to be fully assembled and then towed out to site. So at the point that they are assembled, it's likely to be in a nearshore region, which is potentially, or they commonly have designations and protections. So storing a number of fully assembled turbines in those areas is likely to have HRA implications. Each of those turbines that's stored there is going to need to be anchored, and depending on what form of anchor that you use, you'd need to potentially consider piling noise in the nearshore area, which obviously has impacts on marine mammals and fish. You also have seabed impacts on benthic communities, potentially deeper seabed impacts if they are embedment anchors in those areas. And it's now being recognised that it might not be possible to fully break those turbines while they're in that wet storage. So you may have some element of rotor spin in that nearshore area. So collision risk needs to be considered, and in order to assess that collision risk, you need to make sure that you have carried out thorough ornithological surveys in that area. Whereas for fixed bottom, the ornithological digital aerial survey activity would have been focused primarily on the offshore array area, not the cable routes. And last but not least, obviously with fully assembled turbines in the nearshore area, that would lead to a significant landscape and visual impact, which would not have been the case with fixed bottom turbines. So there are significant issues to consider for wet storage, and currently one of the big issues is who's responsible for carrying out that environmental impact assessment. So stakeholders and regulators don't seem to have reached a consensus on this yet, whether that responsibility lies with the ports and harbour authorities who would be there to host that wet storage area, or whether it would be for developers to consider as part of the boundaries of their project. When the turbines are actually towed out to site and in place for their permanent position, again, we need to think about what impact the anchors are going to have. So I think many people at first thought would have imagined that floating turbines would have potentially a less of an impact on the seabed because there's not a fixed structure attached to the seabed. However, when you think that each turbine may require 10 to 20 anchors each, and each one of those would need some form of attachment to the seabed, either by drag embedment, for example, or pin piles, there's a significant environmental impact that needs to be considered there. So noise in the case of piling, drag embedment could have impacts on archaeology and benthic communities. The mooring lines and floating cables are have been fairly well discussed in other fora. So there's an obvious impact on shipping and navigation. In terms of commercial fisheries, it's likely to create larger exclusion areas for commercial fisheries due to the risks of moving in and around areas with multiple mooring lines and cables. The entanglement issue of marine mammals with those mooring lines and cables is not particularly well understood at the moment. It's recognised that there may potentially be an issue, and this is subject to further research and investigation. And then finally, those mooring lines and floating cables appear to have a what's known as a strimmer effect on the seabed. So as they move within the water column, having an impact on the sediments and communities that are living on the seabed. So in addition to those things, we have the general kind of uncertainty on technology, which could potentially lead to larger Rochdale envelopes that are required in your consent application for offshore wind farms. And yes, this is something that has been highlighted as an issue that the regulators would prefer to narrow down rather than offering such large Rochdale envelopes as have been offered in the past. So all of that sounds fairly negative, but there are some really positive impacts of floating offshore wind as well. So the socioeconomic benefit is one of the key ones, with development of wind farms in potentially more remote areas than have been before, opportunities for major regeneration of ports and local industry, and of course, once those turbines are deployed to their more permanent locations, they're further offshore and they're therefore less seascape and landscape visual impact. So there's lots to consider. Floating will definitely play a big part in achieving our net zero goals. But I just wanted to raise some awareness of some of the early challenges that we're facing in terms of environmental impact assessment with those types of projects. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Nikki and panelists. I think it's really interesting insights, and I think also something that what we've seen in the UK is an extremely successful development of the industry. And you know, as you say, Nikki, that there are some real challenges here, but the reason that the challenges there are significant challenges is the ambitions are very, very significant in just the volume of turbines that need to go into the water to meet those targets. If I can ask the panelists to come back on screen, we'll pick up some questions now, and for the audience members, please feel free to add in some questions as we're going through. And we have a couple to start with. I think if I start with you, Julie, and your thoughts on this, and for the rest of the panelists, and how can we ensure that we engage with stakeholders and capture their views during the development of the compensation proposals?
Yeah, I mean, it's crucial that we take on board the stakeholders' views, that they're part and parcel of being able to develop and agree these compensation plans. So what has become common practice for applicants is to go through what we call the evidence plan process. So it is a voluntary process, but it is set out in DCO guidance, and it has proven quite useful in terms of being able to gauge with multi-parties all in one go. The issue with our stakeholders is that they're incredibly resource constrained. So what we're seeking to do is to get collective views and to reduce as much as possible the burden on our stakeholders to provide multiple rounds of consultation or multiple feedback at different times of development. So through the evidence plan process, you can set up expert topic groups, and so you can focus on ornithology, benthic impacts, And as I say, you can draw in, it's not just the likes of Natural England, but those can include other parties, JNCC, RSPB, anyone who has an interest in that particular topic. And you can develop those expert topic groups around building compensation packages. So it's proven a really useful way of gaining multi-party feedback. There are other ways and means, but I think, that is one of the more efficient ways in which we can gather feedback and get that, get that into the compensation plans.
Yes, I think I'd add to that just from a purely legal perspective, obviously there are certain legal obligations around consultation, and it will be very important for developers to demonstrate that they have, not only undertaken consultation, but also that they've listened appropriately and responded to what consultees have said in a meaningful way. One of the pitfalls of consultation is to think that merely going through the exercise is sufficient from a legal perspective. From a legal point of view, you have to engage in consultation when proposals are at a formative stage, to the extent that the replies of consultees can actually have a meaningful impact. And one of the, obviously, the best ways of demonstrating that was the case is to actually show real engagement and, if necessary, real change in response to what consultees say. And the development of compensation packages is going to be no different to developing any other aspect of the scheme in that regard, I would think.
Agree. And it's about actively listening and taking on board that feedback that's received, and reflecting that in the compensation plans that you take forward into your examination. So, yeah.
Yeah, one of the nicer issues in this is, of course, dealing with what can sometimes be rather tardy and rather inadequate responses from consultees. We've all identified that the demands on the public sector are such that often stakeholders, if from the public sector, don't always respond as quickly as one would want. And I suspect that is going to be one of the challenges, both from a legal and a practical perspective, in weighing up when a consultee simply hasn't themselves engaged, how one can lawfully say that a proper consultation has taken place. And it is one of the bigger challenges that I find that developers encounter.
Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to sort of looking at the strategic measures that are being put in place, then perhaps this will help alleviate the burdens on our stakeholders. When we talk about needing to engage with stakeholders, it's always at that project level. So when we're talking about compensation, if there is this move to have more strategic measures in place, yes, the stakeholders need to be involved with that package of compensation measures that are being put forward at that strategic level. But by the time the developer gets there, those measures are potentially already agreed. So at the project level, you're not having to have that same level of consultation with those stakeholders, at that stage, if you're reliant on the strategic measures. But as I said, they are still a way off. Government are still working on implementing those strategic measures. They're limited to a certain number of projects currently. So it's about broadening that and making it available to new projects that are also coming onto online.
Great. No, thank you very much for that. We've just had a question. What lessons can the UK learn from early adopters of floating offshore wind technology in other countries, policy or other? I think maybe just one thing from my side to add to this is that actually the UK is quite mature in its floating offshore wind market. There are 2 pilot projects already in operation. Putting that into perspective, it's about 80 megawatts of operating capacity. So the fixed bottom market is much larger in the UK. So it is at kind of an earlier stage, but it is very much proven in terms of the deployment at a smaller scale. And I think the challenge is now to actually increase that, bring the costs down, but also, as Nikki mentioned, there's some of the planning challenges. And we're starting to see some larger projects come through. An example is the Green Volt. I've just won a CFD, and that's a circa 500 megawatt project, and the pricing of that is around 140 pounds per megawatt hour. The expectation is by 2030 we'll be coming under the £100, so there is a cost decrease. I don't know if anyone else wants to pick up that question about adopting from other countries the policy or other.
I mean, I think it's crucially important that we do learn lessons from other countries and other, developers that are providing floating offshore wind. As we've seen with any industry, the more that's deployed, the more lessons you learned. I think Nikki alluded to these project envelopes currently being really, really broad, necessarily because we don't know that much about the technology, and it will take, these developers, these sort of these leaders, if you like, to take these developments on and prove the different technology that works, that we can then hone and refine the project envelopes, where we can then be quite specific in the environmental impact assessments, which is all then, is leading on to being able to be more realistic about the impacts that are associated with these developments. So I think it's crucial, and I think it's about encouraging those developers that are the early adopters to share those lessons with the rest of the industry. I think it is happening, but I think it's going to take a few more developers and demonstration projects to come online before we're really starting to see the benefits of those lessons.
I might also add that there's a number of overlaps in terms of developers who are building projects out in the other countries who are coming over to the UK to look at the floating opportunity in the UK. So as Julie says, it's really important to seek opportunities to ensure that those lessons are learned as they move into the UK market. But also worth considering that a lot of the impacts or the technology solutions for delivering offshore wind in the UK will be location specific. It will depend on where you can assemble those turbines, where you can provide the maintenance from, what is the seabed condition like in terms of which technologies you use to for the kind of substructure as well as the anchors. So I think, as Dan mentioned as well, I think the UK is one of the leading markets for rolling out floating, and I think the rest of the world will have a lot to learn from us too. Just putting it out there.
Yeah, no, it's very true, and I think also there's been some very different approaches from different markets. Particularly thinking France has had a much more, it's a different mechanism of leasing and providing the offtake mechanism for floating winds. Japan, Korea have also had different mechanisms, but all progressing their floating winds. So there's definitely lessons being shared between the different governments, as well as what you said, Nikki, in terms of those developers. There's an overlap. And then maybe just a kind of related question on this about what can developers in the industry do more widely to speed up the delivery of floating wind, and particularly through round 5 and 6. Nikki, would you like to tackle that?
Yeah, sure. I think coming back to what Julie was speaking, I think there's quite a lot to do around anticipating that compensation requirement, learning lessons from the east coast of the UK, seeing what can be done to perhaps provide proven compensation methodologies. So, for example, with Hornsea 4, which was one of the first NSIP offshore wind farms to go ahead with a derogation case, the idea of providing kitty-wake artificial nesting structures was quite new at that stage, but it's now accepted that that is a proven methodology for providing compensation. So that in itself is not questioned. It's just how it's delivered and rolled out. So that could be really helpful in terms of kind of expediting delivery and not having to work from first principles. I think there are a number of data gaps which perhaps we could look to try and close ahead of time as well. again, perhaps rolled in with this positive environmental outcome requirement, looking into whether there's research projects that we could be funded to consider, perhaps looking at the entanglement risk, perhaps ruling out or otherwise any EMF risk from floating wind cables. In the Celtic Sea, for example, there are some fairly new species of birds that we might need to consider in our impact assessment, for which there are data gaps. So there might be opportunities to look at that. And then further, sort of thinking about learning from the East Coast as well. There's obviously a lot of work going on at the moment to define a noise threshold, and I think having something like that resolved and agreed and in place as experience will help expedite when those questions undoubtedly come up for round 5 and 6.
Yeah, it might just be worth pointing out here that the law is quite reactive in these circumstances. It tends to respond to what developers come forward with, rather than having any, perhaps unsurprisingly, really having any great role in taking a proactive way of speeding things up. I mean, I've spoken briefly about the amendments to the DCO process, but it is perhaps just worth noting that there is some guidance in the authorities which will allow a sort of broader latitude in the way that environmental impacts are assessed if what's being proposed is a well understood type of remedial or mitigation measure. And therefore, I think there's quite a lot of importance in what Nikki says about the need for being proactive in developing the technologies which could be used to mitigate or compensate some of the effects which are unique to floating turbines. And so, you know, from a lawyer's perspective, although there isn't all that much to say on this type of question, that's probably, you know, the best advice one would be able to give at this stage.
I think about sort of trying to fill those knowledge gaps as well. We already have an awful lot of research that has taken place in offshore renewables. You know, we have programs such as the Offshore Renewable Joint Industry Program, which, you know, focuses on specific research into you know, certain topic areas. And I think it's just identifying what those gaps are and then encouraging these existing mechanisms to sort of focus on helping to plug those sort of data gaps and where, you know, where stakeholders are raising concerns, because they're, you know, we know stakeholders will take the precautionary approach when they don't have all of the evidence and the data to hand. So I think it's just working with the mechanisms that we've got currently. There's some great programs out there, and developing those to focus on the key areas that we're seeing for floating offshore wind.
Yeah, oh, thanks. I think really good points, and I think another potential challenge is around the increasing size of projects, and where you're seeing one of the challenges I see is that the auction, the CFD offtake mechanism, is the lowest price, so it'll naturally go to the larger projects, and where there are numerous 100 megawatt or circa 100 megawatt projects that are consented or nearly consented and ready to go into the CFD, they're very quickly going to have to compete with, you know, the likes of Greenvolt or much larger projects, and that just doesn't allow the smaller projects to get going, build the supply chain up, as you said, Julie, kind of building up the learnings. And I think that's a real challenge, just going from the kind of the 30, 40, 50 megawatt projects up to a gigawatt is a real big step up. So I kind of see that from a policy, a regulatory side, having ways to enable those smaller projects, I think it's a key benefit, without delaying the gigawatt projects, but having a way of having those projects get off take. There's a question just come in asking about, do we have any examples of schemes that have undergone good stakeholder engagement? Keen to see how certain developers may have approached it, looking at best use case. Anything that comes to mind on that?
I mean, I think it comes down to looking at those that have gone through the DCO process with relative ease, I guess. I can't name any sort of projects off the top of my head, but I know the Sheringham and Dudgeon extension projects, they got to quite a level of maturity on their compensation programs before, or compensation plans before their examination closed. And I believe that was because they did a lot of stakeholder engagement prior to the DCO application being made. So that might be one example. And then looking at, I think the 5 estuaries examination that's currently underway, I think they're having a, they obviously every DCO application has its issues, but I think they're having, quite a good process that they're going through. And again, I believe they've done an awful lot of engagement in that pre-DCO stage that has sort of set the scene for a very good examination. There doesn't seem to be many issues coming up through the examination that they haven't already dealt with or already have responses to. So I guess off the top of my head, there are probably 2 that I would say go and have a quick look at.
Great. No, thanks for that, Judy. I think we have just time for one final question. So Andrew, for you, in terms of what role do you think the Labour government statement on the aspiration about increasing supply of renewable energy will play in the decisions before it's turned then into the actual planning policy?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up quite sort of frequently, where you get expressions of government aspiration of one sort or another, and it takes quite a while, particularly in the NSIP concept, I think, context rather, to turn it into actual policy. I mean, the revised NSIPs, NSPs rather, took they took a decade to come to fruition. But it really breaks down into 3 levels. I think at the level of project preparation and examination, it will serve as a sort of mood music to enable some of the issues that we've talked about in terms of resources, in terms of new types of assessment, to be given a relatively benevolent approach. I mean, it's always a fallback in making submissions to point to high-level government statements. So that'll be one impact that undoubtedly it will have. The second is, of course, the nuts and bolts, that the decision maker in an NSIP application is the relevant Secretary of State, who is obviously a political appointee of the government that's making these aspirational statements. And so one would expect to find that the decision-making regime will be benevolent on the back of these aspirations. Where it probably wouldn't make much difference is in legal challenge, where looking at generalized government statements doesn't usually cut much ice when compared to the fairly settled legal hierarchy that comes out of the Planning Act 2008 in terms of the role of the national policy statements, the role of the decision makers' findings, and so forth. So to sort of sum up, the short answer is a bit, but the point that it's where it's most likely to make a difference is in the willingness of ministers to approve schemes, and obviously everything now proposed will have a big following wind behind it from that perspective.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew, and that draws us to an end. The hour has gone very quickly, so really want to thank the panelists for their contributions. I think it's going to be an exciting few years with these projects coming through, and really good to get your experience direct from the projects. I think that's really insightful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks,
everybody.
Dan.
Bye. Thank you.